Hi, welcome back. This is the concluding part of Q2 episode 7, the timeline preceding the event. You will recall in the concluding part of part 1, Gabriel had visited Daniel and explained Daniel chapter 8 prophecy, but verse 13 was left unexplained, and Brother D still could not figure it out. The text reads, "For 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed." Now, succinctly put, it was a timeline that preceded the start of an event. We will attempt to address each of these clues one after another, starting with the timeline. Let's go. Number 1, the preceding timeline, the 2,300 days. Let's get into it. Just like any other timeline, to make this timeline make sense, we need to address the following questions. 1. Is this timeline literal or symbolic? And 2. Regardless, when do we start counting? Now, we will be sticking with our sola scriptura principle, so we will be looking inwards. Now, hidden in this chapter 8 are a number of clues that will help us address these questions and bring clarity to this timeline. So let's get into it. So for the first question, is it 2,300 days or years? You will notice from the figure a couple of clues. This prophecy was given as part of a prophetic overview of Earth's history in Daniel chapter 8, corresponding to chapters 7 and 2, as illustrated in the figure. Just like we learned last week in Q2 episode 6, if the animals in this prophecy were assumed symbolic in Gabriel's interpretation in Daniel 8:15-26, I mean, you can't fault Gabriel, can you? It is consistent to assume that the timeline in this same prophecy is also symbolic, qualifying therefore for the day-year prophetic application, implying 1 day equal to 1 year. Therefore, 2,300 days will be equal to 2,300 years. Question number 2. Okay, so now we have that sorted, but recall, the text suggests that this time period precedes the start of an event, the cleansing of the sanctuary. For this information to be useful, therefore, we need to know where exactly to start the count. Look at it this way. Now, mathematically, Daniel 8:14 will read, 2,300 years minus X will be equal to the event begins, meaning the cleansing of the sanctuary. Let's call that equation 1. Now, if we solve for X, then we can calculate the right-hand side of the equation, which is our point of interest when the event begins. Yeah, I know you don't like maths. Daniel could not decode this either. As a matter of fact, he passed out. So if you don't get it the first time, that's okay. There is enough grace to go around. For those who still think it's not necessary to understand prophecy, this text suggests otherwise. God thinks differently. Think about it. God must have really wanted us to understand this prophecy, so about 2 years later, for the second time, he delegates Gabriel to return and break it out. So Gabriel does, but this time with a different approach, as we'll read in Daniel chapter 9, 24-27. First, Gabriel gives the exact start date for this timeline, with a clue in Daniel chapter 9 verse 25, which in corroboration with Ezra 7 verse 7 resolves to 457 BC. So, equation 1 now resolves to 2300 minus x being 457 BC, and this brings us to the year 1844, when the event begins, accounting for the non-zero year. Now, according to Daniel 8 verse 14, in this particular year, the cleansing of the sanctuary begins, whatever that means. We'll get to that next week. Step number 2. Gabriel then proceeds to break up the timeline into 2 major parts. Let's call them parts A and B. Now, part A is the first 70 weeks cut off from the bulk 2,300 days, while part B is whatever is left of that bulk time period. So to make this make sense, we will be applying the day-year principle to all the time periods for reasons earlier explained. So, part A, being 70 weeks, becomes 490 years. How do we get that? 70 weeks by 7 days gives us 490 days, which equal to 490 years. And while part B becomes the bulk time minus part A time, meaning 2,300 years minus 490 years of part A, which gives 1,810. So in summary, mathematically speaking, Gabriel splits this 2,300 time period into 2 parts, part A lasting for a period of 490 years and part B lasting for a period of 1,810 years. Now at this point, I'm guessing Daniel would have been so overwhelmed had Daniel downloaded the details of events in both parts of this 2,300 year timeline. So, Gabriel focuses exclusively on the details of events in part A, the first 490 years, dealing with Daniel and his people, the Jewish nation. Step number 3. To help Daniel understand, Gabriel further breaks up part A into 3 sub-timelines, 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and 1 week. And for each sub-timeline, he details events that will either happen during the timeline or at the end of the sub-timeline. And you just cannot miss it. The text reads, "From the issuing of the decree to rebuild Jerusalem till Jesus is anointed in baptism shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, totaling 69 weeks. Now, within the first 7 weeks, meaning the first 49 years of part A, Jerusalem will be rebuilt even in troublesome times. 62 weeks later, meaning 434 years later, Jesus will be baptized in AD 27. That's 69 weeks gone. 1 more week to go. Now, the last 1 week is split into 2 halves, 2 weeks. 1 week meaning 7 years. And the midst of the week, meaning in the first half of the last 1 week, Jesus will confirm the covenant with his blood, thus annulling the old sacrificial system. And this coincides with AD 31 when Jesus was crucified. Now, within the last half of that same last week, Israel will confirm her rejection of the covenant as a nation in stoning Stephen following an order from the Sanhedrin. And this concludes the 70-week prophecy, which is equal to 490 years. In 2,000 plus years later, history confirms you couldn't have been more precise with each of these dates and events. Even the details of the future are laid bare before our God. Amazing. What to remember thus far? 1. If you do not fully understand or remember the details of these calculations thus far this first time, that's okay. At least you were still conscious. Daniel wasn't. The dude passed out. So you're doing pretty good. Number 2. In summary, the timeline starts from from the issuing of the decree to rebuild Jerusalem in 457 BC, and it extends till 1844. Thus far, this interpretation is in sync with our sola scriptura principle. Now, number 3. This prophecy was first given in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, approximately around 550 AD thereabout, detailing with precision events that span over 2,000 years in the future. A very concrete evidence that the details of the future are indeed laid out bare before our God. What an honor and privilege to have this same God assume us as his responsibility. No better place to be. So, if you forget everything else today, this is a good takeaway that God can indeed be trusted. Clue number 2 in decoding Daniel 8 verse 14, the events, cleansing of the sanctuary. Question is, what exactly does cleansing the sanctuary mean? Now, William Miller and his associates had interpreted the sanctuary as the earth and concluded, therefore, that the text must imply the second coming of Jesus to purge the earth of sin and sinners with fire. The calculations they got right, but this conclusion is where they got it wrong. And next week, we'll find out why and explore the details out. So please kindly subscribe and be on the lookout for the next clip exploring these details. I'll see you then. Thank you for joining in today. Please kindly like, share, and subscribe. And please stay tuned for next week for the concluding part. It's your Sabas Kudodo, doodling out. I'll see you next week.